Most people picture Iran as a nation boxed in by sanctions and conflict. But beneath the surface, Iran is reshaping the Middle East, not through armies, but through railways, pipelines, ports, and energy deals that bind its neighbors by necessity, not by force. Sanctions that aim to isolate Tehran have instead forced a new strategy, building critical connections that quietly reroute trade and power across the region. Why is this non-military approach so hard to reverse, and what might it mean for tomorrow's balance of power? The answer begins with the shock that changed Iran's doctrine forever. In 1979, Iran's revolutionaries overthrew the Shah and declared a new republic built on the promise of independence from foreign powers. The leadership quickly made economic self-sufficiency a national priority, framing it as a matter of survival. This idea, resist outside pressure and rely on domestic resources, became a guiding principle for the state. Just a year later, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded, launching an 8-year war. Iranian cities came under missile attack. Oil exports, the backbone of the economy, dropped sharply. Imports of spare parts and industrial goods slowed to a trickle. In response, the government poured resources into building what it called a fortress economy. Factories were repurposed to supply both the front lines and the home front. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, emerged not only as a military force, but as a key player in reconstruction and logistics. Its engineering arm, Qatam al-Anbiya, took on major infrastructure projects, learning to operate under siege conditions and to bypass international suppliers when necessary. This wartime experience left a deep imprint. By the time the guns fell silent in 1988, Iran's leaders saw self-reliance not just as an ideal, but as a necessity. The country's institutions, from ministries to state-backed conglomerates, were shaped by the memory of isolation and the need to keep critical systems running even when cut off from the outside world. The IRGC's dual role as both military guardian and builder of roads, ports, and pipelines became a fixture of the post-war state. When new waves of international sanctions arrived decades later, targeting Iran's banking, energy, and shipping sectors, the government drew on this legacy. Rather than collapse or capitulate, Iran's leadership doubled down on the doctrine forged in revolution and war. They turned inward, relying on state and parastate enterprises to fill the gaps left by departing foreign firms. Contracts for major infrastructure went to organizations with proven records of operating under pressure, often those with ties to the IRGC. This foundation of resilience, built in the crucible of conflict and scarcity, would shape every aspect of Iran's later approach to regional power. It explains why, for Iran, sanctions stung but did not break the system, and why the tools of influence would soon shift from the battlefield to the construction site, the port, and the power grid. Sanctions first struck Iran's economy in the mid-2000s, targeting its banking, shipping, and especially its energy sector, the main artery of national revenue. In 2006, the United Nations Security Council imposed restrictions over Iran's nuclear program, measures that were soon joined by the United States and the European Union. These actions grew steadily more severe through 2015, cutting access to global finance and deterring foreign investment. Oil exports, once a reliable source of hard currency, fell sharply. Major Western firms withdrew from infrastructure and energy projects, leaving unfinished pipelines and idle cranes in their wake. By 2012, Iran's leaders faced a new reality. The rial lost half its value in a single year. Inflation soared and government budgets tightened. State planners responded by shifting contracts for roads, ports, and power plants to domestic and parastate firms, often those with proven records of working under pressure. Qatam al-Anbiya, the engineering arm of the Revolutionary Guard, became a default choice for projects once managed by international companies. Meanwhile, policymakers looked eastward, seeking partners in China, Russia, and among regional neighbors who were less exposed to Western penalties. A brief window opened in 2015 when the nuclear agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action lifted many restrictions. For 2 years, Iran's oil exports rebounded and European companies explored new ventures. Yet the optimism proved short-lived. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the deal and reimposed sanctions with greater force. Oil revenues plunged again, falling by more than half within a year. The government's access to international banking narrowed to a trickle, and trade shifted into informal channels such as front companies, barter arrangements, and regional intermediaries. This cycle of pressure and adaptation hardened a particular approach to survival. Instead of waiting for sanctions to lift, Iran began to treat external constraints as a permanent condition. Economic policy centered on building assets that could withstand isolation, infrastructure that served both domestic needs and regional ambitions, contracts that tied neighbors to Iranian supply lines, and networks that bypassed formal finance altogether. The years between 2006 and 2018 became a proving ground for these methods, turning sanctions from a threat into a catalyst for a new kind of influence. What followed was not a retreat, but a redirection that would soon reshape Iran's role across the Middle East. On Iran's southeastern coast, far from the crowded shipping lanes of the Persian Gulf, Chabahar port rises from the arid landscape of Sistan, Baluchistan. For decades, this stretch of shoreline saw little international traffic. That changed in May 2016 when Iran, India, and Afghanistan signed a trilateral agreement to transform Chabahar into a regional transit hub. The plan was ambitious: to build deep water berths, link the port to inland railways, and open a new route to Central Asia that would bypass Pakistan entirely. Within months, India committed more than $500 million for port development, including cranes, cargo equipment, and a new terminal. The first wheat shipment bound for Afghanistan arrived in October 2017, signaling the port's operational debut. By December 2017, Iranian officials inaugurated the Shahid Beheshti terminal, expanding Chabahar's capacity to over 8 million tons a year. India soon took over operations under an 18-month lease, later extended to a 10-year concession in 2024, with a goal of handling 500,000 containers annually. Chabahar's strategic value lies in its geography. Unlike Bandar Abbas, which sits near the Strait of Hormuz and is vulnerable to blockade or tension, Chabahar opens directly onto the Gulf of Oman. This location allows cargo to move from India to Afghanistan and Central Asia without passing through Pakistani territory. For Indian planners, the port offers a way to counter China's investment in Pakistan's Gwadar port, just 72 kilometers away. For Iran, it means attracting foreign capital and embedding itself in regional supply chains, even as sanctions restrict access to Western finance. Progress has not been smooth. United States sanctions have deterred many investors, and only a fraction of the port's capacity is currently used, much of it for Indian aid shipments to Afghanistan. The planned railway linking Chabahar to Zahedan and onward to Central Asia has been delayed by funding shortfalls and legal hurdles. Yet the port remains operational, with Indian equipment on the docks and Iranian authorities managing customs and security. Each new shipment that passes through Chabahar represents a small but tangible shift in regional trade patterns, offering Iran and its partners a maritime alternative outside the reach of their rivals. In the province of Hormozgan, two ports anchor Iran's maritime strategy: Bandar Abbas and Bandar-e-Jask. Bandar Abbas, long the country's main gateway for international shipping, sits just north of the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point for nearly 1/5 of the world's traded oil. For decades, the port handled the bulk of Iran's imports and exports, its container terminals bustling even under sanctions. Yet its location also makes it a target in times of tension, and Iranian planners have grown wary of relying on a single exposed lifeline. The answer lies farther east, where construction crews and engineers have transformed the fishing village of Jask into a deep water port with oil wharfs and storage tanks. Unlike Bandar Abbas, Jask opens directly onto the Gulf of Oman, allowing tankers to load crude without passing through the narrow strait. This redundancy is deliberate. In 2020, Iran financed a major phase of the Jask project through an offshore vehicle based in Oman, using legal opinions to reassure insurers and keep international shipping firms engaged. The details of these arrangements remain closely held, but the effect is clear. Even as new sanctions arrived, Jask's wharfs continued to receive tankers, and oil shipments to Syria and other partners persisted, often routed through vessels flying flags of convenience and through third-party brokers. Port authorities in Hormozgan have learned to operate under pressure. They coordinate weekly with shipping agents and insurance intermediaries to keep cargo moving, drawing on a network of informal contacts built over years of isolation. After the United States reimposed sanctions in 2018, official statistics show that overall volumes dipped but never collapsed. By 2022, satellite data and ship tracking services still recorded steady flows of condensate and refined products from Jask and Bandar Abbas, with anchorage maps showing a gradual shift in tanker activity toward the newer port. This dual port system gives Iran a measure of resilience that few regional rivals can match. Should one choke point come under threat, the other can take up the slack. The ability to redirect oil exports and commercial shipments in real time complicates efforts to isolate Iran economically. Each vessel that clears customs at Jask or Bandar Abbas represents not just a transaction, but a layer of strategic depth. Proof that, even under pressure, Iran's maritime arteries remain open. These ports are more than logistics hubs. They are instruments of national endurance and the foundation for new overland corridors that stretch deep into the region. A 160-kilometer stretch of unfinished railway separates the Iranian city of Rasht from Astara on the Azerbaijan border. Engineers and surveyors have spent years charting a route through dense forests and flood-prone valleys, aiming to close the final gap in the international north-south transport corridor. This corridor promises to link the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea and onward to Russia, transforming Iran from a regional endpoint into a central overland bridge for freight moving between Asia and Europe. Joint financing agreements between Iran and Russia were signed in 2023, with Russian capital and technical teams joining Iranian rail authorities to accelerate construction. The planned route will require more than 20 tunnels and 15 bridges, a response to the region's challenging terrain. Once complete, the Rasht to Astra link could handle up to 15 million tons of cargo per year, slashing transit times and costs compared to traditional sea routes. For Iranian planners, closing this gap is not just an engineering challenge. It is a chance to redraw the region's commercial map. In March 2021, Iran and China signed a sweeping 25-year cooperation framework, laying out plans for joint investments in ports, energy, industry, and transport. The agreement included a series of memoranda of understanding with major Chinese state firms such as China National Petroleum Corporation and China Harbor Engineering Company. These documents outline Chinese involvement in upgrading Iranian ports on the Gulf of Oman, expanding oil and gas infrastructure, and integrating Iran into China's Belt and Road Initiative. The financial arrangements bypassed traditional Western banks and instead used alternative payment channels and barter schemes designed to shield both sides from U.S. sanctions. For Iranian planners, Chinese participation offered more than capital. It provided a form of diplomatic insurance, making it harder for rivals to isolate Iranian projects without confronting Beijing. The presence of Chinese contractors and financiers at key infrastructure sites normalized Iran's position in regional supply chains, even as formal trade ties with the West remained frozen. This external backing enabled Iran to keep building and operating critical assets, embedding its economy deeper into Eurasian networks and complicating efforts to disrupt its regional ambitions through financial pressure alone. Iran's reach extends beyond ports and railways, sinking deep into the power lines and construction sites of its neighbors. In Iraq, daily life depends on electricity flowing from Iranian grids. Contracts signed in the 2000s locked Baghdad into long-term imports, with Iranian power and natural gas keeping lights on through scorching summers and frequent blackouts. When Iraq's parliament debated these deals in July 2021, the urgency was clear. Without Iranian supply, entire provinces risk going dark. Armenia relies on a different arrangement. A swap contract sends Iranian gas north, with electricity flowing back south, binding the two countries through a network of pipelines and transmission lines built over decades. This pattern repeats across the region. Iranian-linked firms, especially Khatam al-Anbiya, and companies tied to the Popular Mobilization Forces, win a disproportionate share of reconstruction tenders in Iraq and Syria. These contracts fund roads, housing, and utilities, embedding Iranian influence in the daily routines of millions. The sums involved are opaque, but the mechanism is unmistakable. Control over energy and reconstruction turns technical dependence into lasting leverage. Four main mechanisms explain how infrastructure projects become instruments of power in Iran's regional strategy. The first is sunk cost. When a partner state allows an Iranian firm to build a port, railway, or power plant, the investment itself creates a barrier to reversal. Dismantling a completed terminal or switching energy suppliers carries high financial and political costs, and it makes the initial choice difficult to unwind. The second is long-term concessions and contracts. Decade-spanning leases, joint ventures, and supply agreements embed Iranian-linked entities into the host country's bureaucracy, providing legal standing and local allies who benefit from ongoing cooperation. Third, there is the logic of entanglement. Infrastructure ties daily economic life, such as electricity, fuel, or shipping access, to Iranian-operated networks. As a result, any disruption to these links threatens basic services, and it raises the stakes for local governments and populations alike. Finally, maritime leverage comes from controlling or bypassing choke points. By operating ports outside traditional bottlenecks and offering alternative trade corridors, Iran gains the ability to redirect flows and to complicate efforts to isolate or sanction its partners. Together, these mechanisms transform physical assets into lasting influence, often without the need for open confrontation. Attempts to counter Iran's infrastructure strategy run into a web of legal, financial, and political barriers that make enforcement far from straightforward. Many of Iran's projects operate under long-term concession contracts, often signed with host governments or local authorities. These agreements grant Iranian or allied firms legal standing, making it costly for partners to unwind deals without triggering penalties or disrupting essential services. Insurance and shipping norms further complicate efforts to isolate Iranian-linked assets. When Bandar Ajask expanded its oil terminals in 2020, project financing moved through offshore vehicles in Oman, with legal opinions designed to reassure international insurers and avoid blacklisting. Third-party involvement acts as a shield. Chinese and Russian firms, as well as regional companies, participate in joint ventures that blur lines of ownership and responsibility. Iran's 2021 framework with China and its 2024 accession to BRICS provide forums where disputes can be managed outside Western-led systems. This stakeholder network creates a form of collective resistance to sanctions because disrupting one node can draw in actors with competing interests. Scenario modeling draws on satellite imagery, vessel tracking data, and trade statistics to assess how these networks adapt. If sanctions intensify, Iran's partners may deepen their reliance on alternative payment channels and barter. If regional corridors like IMEC gain traction, Iran's leverage could be diluted, but sunk investments and legal entanglements will persist. Data from AIS, UN Comtrade, and open-source contract repositories reveal that even under pressure, the infrastructure web resists easy unraveling. Today, new railways and pipelines shape the region's alliances more than any battlefield. As Iran's networks expand, economic interdependence quietly redraws borders and priorities across the Middle East. These ties resist easy sanctions or military pushback, and every new connection makes reversal harder. Influence now travels by freight, not force. The future of the region may depend on who builds the next bridge. Share your thoughts below.